3 people are dead, a British crew member is fighting for their life, and a ship carrying 150 passengers, including 17 Americans, is stranded off the coast of West Africa because no port will let them in. The MV Hantavirus has a suspected hantavirus outbreak on board, and the WHO, the same WHO that fumbled the early weeks of COVID, is now telling us they think the virus may have spread between passengers, which is something hantavirus almost never does. This is a developing crisis with serious questions about institutional failure, international health architecture, and what happens when the systems we've built to protect us simply don't work fast enough. Joining me now are Marcus Webb, our defense and security analyst, and Sophia Reeves, our economics and markets editor. Marcus, let me start with you. Is this a one-off tragedy, or does this tell us something damning about the state of our international health response?
Thanks, Emma. Look, this is both, and that's what makes it so dangerous. 3 people are dead, and the immediate instinct from every major health institution is to manage the optics rather than name the failures. The WHO is monitoring the situation. Ports are refusing entry, and patients who need specialist medical care are floating off the West African coastline, while bureaucrats draft carefully worded statements. This is the same WHO that in January 2020 was still praising China's transparency while a novel coronavirus was spreading globally. Tucker Carlson made the point during COVID that an international body with no enforcement mechanism and every incentive to avoid offending member states is not a safety net. It's a liability dressed in respectable clothing. That diagnosis applies here with full force. And here's what I want to know. Where are the governments? 17 Americans on that ship, British nationals in critical condition. Where is the bilateral diplomatic pressure to secure port access? Where is the urgency? If Western governments are sitting back waiting for the WHO to sort this out, they've learned absolutely nothing from the last 6 years.
But Marcus, isn't that a bit unfair? Port refusals in a disease outbreak scenario aren't exactly unprecedented. Those governments have their own populations to protect. And Sophia, what's your take on this? Is this fundamentally a health failure, or is there an accountability gap here that goes deeper?
Well, look, Marcus is right that the institutional response is inadequate, but I think he's framing it too narrowly around the WHO. Here's what I think Marcus is missing. This is also a catastrophic market failure in the cruise industry itself. These companies operate globally. They profit enormously. They carry passengers from dozens of countries into biosecurity environments that vary wildly in their standards. And the question of what rodent exposure protocols exist on a vessel operating in regions where hantavirus is endemic, that question apparently wasn't being asked rigorously enough. Hantavirus fatality rates run anywhere from 1% to over 40% depending on the variant. The 1993 Sin Nombre outbreak in the American Southwest killed more than half the people it infected. This is not an obscure risk, and when industry self-regulation produces the minimum viable biosecurity standard, which is what happens in the absence of meaningful liability and enforcement, you get 3 dead passengers on a ship that can't find a port. The families of those Dutch passengers deserve to know why the protocols that should have caught this didn't.
I hear what Sophia is saying, but with respect, that misses the point entirely when it comes to the immediate crisis. Yes, we need better industry standards. Yes, there are long-term market accountability questions. But right now, today, there are people dying on a ship. Short, punchy reality check. No port will let them in. The WHO suspects human-to-human transmission. Patients are being prepared for evacuation, which means they haven't been evacuated yet. This is sovereign governments failing their own citizens in real time. Ben Shapiro has said it plainly. When institutions fail, nations must act unilaterally in defense of their own people. The United States government and the British government should be on the phone with every relevant government in that region, making it diplomatically and economically clear that their citizens will have port access and medical care. That's not a market question. That's a failure of national will.
Here's what I want to know, and this is the question that really keeps me up at night. If the WHO confirms human-to-human transmission of a virus that almost never spreads that way, what does that mean for how we handle the next 6 months of this? Sophia, where do you see this playing out?
The way I see this playing out, there are really 2 tracks running simultaneously, and they're pulling in opposite directions. On the science track, if human-to-human transmission is confirmed, the cruise industry faces a confidence crisis it genuinely cannot afford. COVID nearly broke that sector. Another major biosecurity failure associated with confined vessels and vulnerable passengers. The trajectory suggests catastrophic damage to bookings, to insurance frameworks, to the whole model. On the accountability track, though, and this is where I get genuinely pessimistic, history tells us that if this resolves with 3 deaths and a few recoveries and no formal attribution of institutional failure, nothing changes. The WHO walks away with its dysfunction intact. The cruise industry files this under rare incident, and we're having this same conversation in 5 years about a different ship and a different pathogen.
Here's what concerns me most. It's the port refusal precedent. If countries can simply decline to accept vessels carrying sick Western nationals without any diplomatic consequence, that becomes normalized. And the risk here is that we're building a world where international health emergencies become prolonged standoffs. Sick passengers floating in international waters while governments calculate their own domestic political risk from accepting a ship associated with a deadly virus. The trajectory, if current trends continue, is that Western nations lose the ability to guarantee even basic medical access to their own citizens abroad. That is a sovereignty failure of the first order. And if Washington and London aren't treating this as the serious diplomatic emergency it is, somebody needs to be held to account for that negligence.
Marcus Webb, Sophia Reeves, powerful analysis from both of you tonight. One thing is certain. Somewhere in Geneva, there's a WHO official drafting a very careful press release, and 3 families are burying their loved ones who deserved better than careful language.